The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the county courthouse, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Margaret Hayes stood near the clerk's desk, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, her dark suit perfectly pressed. She had worked as the head clerk at this courthouse for 32 years, and she took pride in knowing everything and everyone who walked through those doors. Or so she thought. The heavy oak doors swung open, and a young black woman entered, her heels clicking confidently against the polished floor. She wore a tailored blue-gray suit, her hair styled in an elegant bun. She carried a leather briefcase and moved with quiet purpose. Margaret looked up from her paperwork and immediately felt a familiar sense of superiority wash over her. She had seen hundreds of people come through these doors, nervous defendants, worried family members, fresh-faced lawyers still finding their way. This young woman, probably in her early 30s, must be here for a court appearance, Margaret assumed. The woman approached the desk with a polite smile. "Good morning," she said warmly. Margaret barely looked up. "Name?" she asked curtly, already reaching for the daily docket. "Excuse me," the woman replied, her smile faltering slightly. "Your name," Margaret repeated impatiently. "Which courtroom are you scheduled for?" "Traffic violations are in room 3, small claims in room 5. The young woman took a breath, maintaining her composure. "I think there might be some confusion." Margaret let out a small laugh, the kind that doesn't quite reach the eyes. "Honey, I've been working here longer than you've been alive. I know exactly what I'm doing. Now, if you don't have your paperwork ready, you'll need to step aside and let me help the people who are prepared." A few other staff members nearby glanced over, some looking uncomfortable at Margaret's tone. But Margaret had seniority, and no one dared to correct her. The young woman stood quietly for a moment, her hands folded in front of her. "Ma'am, I appreciate your dedication to your work, but I'm not here for a case." Margaret rolled her eyes and let out another dismissive laugh. "Of course you're not. Let me guess, you're looking for the public defender's office. That's on the second floor. Or are you here to apply for a clerical position? Because I'm afraid we're not hiring right now." The condescension in Margaret's voice was unmistakable. Several people in the lobby had stopped what they were doing, watching the exchange with growing discomfort. The young woman remained calm, though something flickered in her eyes, a mixture of disappointment and resolve. "Mrs. Hayes," she said, reading the nameplate on the desk, "I understand you're very busy, but if you could just—" "How do you know my name?" Margaret interrupted, suddenly suspicious. "Are you here to file some kind of complaint? Because let me tell you, young lady, I run a tight ship here, and I don't appreciate—" "Margaret." The voice came from behind them, firm but measured. Margaret turned to see Judge Thompson, one of the senior judges, approaching from the hallway. He was a man in his late 60s with silver hair and kind eyes that had seen decades of courtroom drama. "Judge Thompson," Margaret said, straightening up immediately, her tone shifting to something more respectful. "I was just helping this young woman find where she needs to go." Judge Thompson walked closer, and Margaret noticed something in his expression, a mixture of amusement and concern. "Margaret, do you know who you're speaking to?" Margaret glanced back at the young woman, then at the judge, confusion crossing her face. "Some defendant who doesn't have her paperwork in order, I assume." Judge Thompson sighed deeply. "Margaret, I'd like to introduce you to Judge Diane Morrison. She was appointed by the governor last month and will be presiding over Courtroom 2 starting today." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "Judge," she whispered. Diane Morrison extended her hand, her expression professional but her eyes carrying the weight of what had just transpired. "It's nice to meet you formally, Mrs. Hayes." Margaret stared at the outstretched hand as if it were a foreign object. Her mind raced, replaying every word she had said, every dismissive laugh, every assumption. Slowly, mechanically, she reached out and shook Diane's hand, her palm clammy with embarrassment. I had no idea," Margaret stammered. "Your Honor, I am so sorry. I didn't mean, I thought." Diane held up her hand gently. "It's all right, Mrs. Hayes. Mistakes happen." But it wasn't all right, and everyone in that lobby knew it. This wasn't a simple case of mistaken identity. This was something deeper, something that had been building in Margaret's heart for years without her even realizing it, the assumptions she made based on what people looked like, the judgments she passed before hearing a single word. Judge Thompson cleared his throat. "Judge Morrison, I apologize for this welcome. Margaret, perhaps we should speak in my chambers. Margaret felt tears prickling at her eyes, but she blinked them back. She had built her reputation on being professional, on being the person who knew everything. And now, in one humiliating moment, that reputation lay in pieces at her feet. Your Honor, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper, I truly apologize. There's no excuse for how I treated you. Diane looked at Margaret for a long moment. She could have been angry. She could have demanded disciplinary action. She had every right to make this a formal complaint. But as she looked at the older woman, she saw something she had seen many times before, someone confronted with their own prejudices, forced to look in a mirror they had been avoiding for years. Mrs. Hayes, Diane said softly, I accept your apology. But I hope you'll think about what happened here today. Because the next person who walks through those doors deserving respect might not be wearing a judge's robe. They might be a defendant, or a witness, or someone seeking justice. And they all deserve to be treated with dignity, regardless of what they look like or what you assume about them. Margaret nodded, unable to speak, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. Judge Thompson touched Diane's arm gently. Let me show you to your chambers, Judge Morrison. You have a full docket today. As they walked away, Margaret stood frozen at her desk. The other clerks and staff members slowly returned to their work, but the atmosphere had changed. Something profound had happened in that lobby, a moment of truth that would ripple through the courthouse for weeks to come. Later that afternoon, as the courthouse quieted down, Margaret found herself standing outside Courtroom 2. Through the small window in the door, she could see Judge Morrison presiding over a case. She was patient with the defendant, a young man who could barely afford a lawyer. She listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and treated everyone in her courtroom with respect. Margaret watched for several minutes, and something inside her began to shift. She thought about her own life, about the times she had been dismissed or overlooked, about the moments when someone had made assumptions about her based on her age or her gender. She thought about her granddaughter, who was about Judge Morrison's age, trying to make her way in a world that didn't always give her a fair chance. That evening, Margaret went home and sat with her husband of 40 years. Harold, she said quietly, I did something terrible today. And she told him everything. Harold listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he took her hand. What are you going to do about it? Margaret thought for a long moment. I'm going to be better. I'm going to do better. The next morning, Margaret arrived at the courthouse early. She found a small bouquet of flowers and a handwritten note at a local shop. The note was simple, Your Honor, thank you for the lesson in grace. With respect, Margaret Hayes. She left them outside Judge Morrison's chambers before anyone else arrived. When Judge Morrison found the flowers later that morning, she read the note twice, then carefully placed the bouquet on her desk where she could see them throughout the day. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it begins with a single step, a moment of recognition, a choice to be better than we were yesterday. Margaret Hayes had taken that step, and though she would never forget the shame of that morning, she would carry forward the lesson it taught her. And Judge Diane Morrison, as she sat in her courtroom dispensing justice with wisdom and compassion, knew that sometimes the most important verdicts aren't delivered from the bench, but in the quiet moments when we choose to see each other as we truly are, human beings worthy of dignity and respect. The courthouse continued its daily rhythm, but something had shifted in its heart, a reminder that we are all, in the end, works in progress, capable of both great mistakes and greater redemptions. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Leave a comment below about a time when you learned an important lesson about assumptions and respect. Your stories inspire others and remind us all that we're on this journey together.